I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another Faculty Friday. 2 weeks ago, the world watched as Brazil conducted a runoff election between Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, otherwise known as Lula, and Jair Bolsonaro for the presidency. It's really hard to imagine a more stark choice. Lula, the former president and champion of the left, and Bolsonaro, the incumbent, a Trump acolyte, and an exemplar of a brand of right-wing and increasingly authoritarian leaders we see around the world. Leading up to the election, there was considerable speculation as to whether Bolsonaro would accept the results if he lost and whether Brazil's democracy would hold. Well, he did lose narrowly, and it appears that there will be an orderly transition of power to Lula. With me today to discuss the election and its implications for Brazil-U.S. relations, indeed for world politics, is an expert on Brazil, my colleague, Professor Aaron Schneider. Aaron is professor and director of our Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies, ICROS, at the Korbel School. Professor Schneider's work focuses on the political economy of development and democracy, how money influences what governments do, who is in, who is out, and who will enjoy what the benefits of membership. Professor Schneider has published books on state building in Central America and urban development in the United States, and his main ongoing research project is a comparative project on India and Brazil. That project explores the position and role of emerging powers in the midst of global capitalist crisis and the contemporary world disorder. I'll be speaking with Aaron for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And with that, welcome to Faculty Friday, Aaron.
I'll unmute myself to say thank you so much, Fritz, and to everybody who's here. I can see the participants streaming into the Zoom room, and I see many friends and some even from Brazil. So welcome, and thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you indeed. Well, many in the audience will know a great deal, of course, about Brazil, but for those in the audience who might not follow Brazilian politics so closely, Aaron, tell us about the two candidates and what was at stake really in the Brazilian election. Maybe start with Bolsonaro. Who is he and what does he stand for?
Sure. Jair Bolsonaro has been president since 2019 until now. He spent 27 years in Congress before that, relatively uneventful and insignificant as a congressperson. Occasional outbursts of praise for the military regime that had preceded the transition to democracy in 1985, and some quite offensive outbursts, things like saying to a female colleague that she was too ugly to rape. So he's a pretty unsavory character. He ran in 2018 and won with a theme, Boy, Biblia, and Bala, beef, Bible, and bullets. And he captured this 2018 moment when the left had been upended by a number of sort of contingent events. The traditional right wing in Brazil had demonstrated their electoral inviolability over some previous years. And so even though this moment was contingent and the rise of Bolsonaro on that platform was contingent, there are ways to consider its wider significance. We'll talk about that later.
Right, and what about Lula? He's been on the world stage for quite a long time, but perhaps you'll agree with me that it's a pretty stark choice between the two of them. But say a few words about who he is and what he stood for.
Sure. Lula was originally a labor leader, leader of the new unionism movement in Brazil in the 1970s, a key figure in the democratization struggle in the 1970s and 1980s. With the transition to democracy and efforts to liberalize the Brazilian economy, he stood for president several times on a platform of pursuing social equity and addressing some of the inequities that were produced by the pattern of liberalization that Brazil was pursuing. He won the presidency in 2003, served 2 terms until 2010 as the leader of the Workers' Party, the PT, as it's known for its Brazilian label. And, so he really is a historic figure in Brazil, for the left, in Latin America, and for the global South. His return to the presidency represents the victory of a very broad coalition. Remains to be seen how he'll govern. He's being pulled in many competing different directions, in fact, from the left that he's traditionally represented, lower classes, eager to recover, the losses that they've experienced over the previous years of Bolsonaro and before, but also a center-right that joined with Lula to get Bolsonaro out of power. They accept Lula as a democratic leader, but they would much rather a neoliberal sort of upper class economic agenda. And so it's going to be seen how Lula governs.
Well, so quite a division, quite a divide between the two of them, and Brazilian politics, perhaps like our own, is pretty divided. This was a really close election. And indeed, Bolsonaro got 58 million people voted for him, and he and his allies, I think, have a majority in the Brazilian Congress and perhaps among governors as well. And yet, Lula won. So, how do you interpret the results? Why did Lula win? Why this? What are we to make of that?
Sure. I mean, the observation about the significant support that Bolsonaro drew, 58 million voters in support of a neo-fascist, socially exclusionary, upper class economic project, is significant, anti-democratic at its core. And I think that what we can say is that the extreme right, the far right, is here to stay in Brazil and around the world. I think we observe, but in Brazil significantly, and they have these institutional bases, as you note, in Congress, in the Senate, amongst the governors. They are going to continue to influence policy and to influence the way in which politics is waged. In an undemocratic way, unfortunately, and so it's really going to be a challenge for Lula and the front that brought him together. He won by 2 million votes, which is significant, and 60 million people did vote for that broad front. And I think that victory is, first of all, significant for Brazilian democracy and for the institutions of Brazilian democracy. So the systems that are in place to defend against the manipulations that might be attempted at this point, they are strengthened by this victory. And if anyone can survive, what is coming ahead, actually, Lula is the one. He has shown over decades of political experience that he is extremely wise as far as how the game of politics is played, and so he's quite skillful at engaging with those who may not agree on everything but are willing to enter into a coalition. And that's the way that Brazilian coalitional politics, coalitional presidentialism, as it's called, operates. And so Lula is the kind of politician that may be able to survive this moment.
Well, I was struck, and I want to come back to how he's going to govern and what are the implications for issues that that he faces in Brazil. But I was really struck before the election. Of course, there was a lot of conversation about whether Bolsonaro would accept the results. I think he declined to make that clear, and so there was a lot of concern that if he lost, that he wouldn't step down. And we've seen in this country election deniers at least try to contest the election, and yet Brazil voted remarkably. I think within 3 hours, unlike our system, you had the total vote, and it looks from afar like he was sort of boxed in, but that he was grudgingly compelled to accept the results. But to talk about how Brazil conducts elections, because as we said, as we talk today, we're still counting votes in Nevada and Arizona, and we've got we haven't even concluded our election, even though it happened almost 2 weeks after theirs. How does Brazil, how does Brazil conduct its elections, and why does it, at least for now, appear that there'll be a smooth transfer of power?
Sure. I mean, the U.S. could learn a lot from Brazil when it comes to running elections. That much is clear. They have electronic voting, and the results from each voting machine go, directly to the electoral tribunal and are tallied there. And it, as you mentioned, it's just a matter of hours before they have their results. They are clear, and therefore you don't get the kind of nonsense that you get on election night and questioning several days later. The ballots, it's all very clear. Voting is mandatory. 80% participation in these rounds of the first and second rounds of the election. In order to help people vote, in the major cities, they offered free transportation to get people to the polls on a Sunday, a non-working day. So lots of ways in which democracy is made easy and clear in Brazil. And so I think that absolutely contributed to what I hope is going to be a smooth transition. And Bolsonaro did say the election is over and there will be a peaceful transfer led by my aide. So he has not yet said that he believes all the results, but he has indicated that the election is over. But I think what has been clear even since then is that the attacks are going to be constant. And so immediately after the elections, there were blockades on the roads. Truckers, left their trucks on the road, and people blocked the roads in an attempt to kind of create chaos and, who knows, bring in the military, the police. Those failed. Then there was a military report that reviewed the results of the election, another opportunity in which perhaps doubt might have been cast. But in fact, that report came back 100% positive, saying we believe, completely these results. There are ways in which there might have been some room for an attack, but there was clearly no attack. So on each potential attack on Brazilian democracy, it has been overcome so far. I expect more to come. I expect Lula and all of his talents to be thinking about where these are going to come from. But we can expect more. And in fact, I think that the first one, as we've said, because of the calculus of those congressional and Senate results in the election, there are going to be impeachment processes. Brazil is a country that has impeached presidents in the past. I expect on day one that big bloc in Congress of Bolsonaro supporters are going to find ways to introduce motions of impeachment. Baseless though they may be, that is going to be one of their attacks.
Yeah, well, that leads well into the my next question, really, which is, let's assume the story's not completely over, but assume that as it looks like Lula will at least be in office, but immediately with an oppositional Congress and is it Congress and Senate that's the two bodies in Brazil, and so then the question is sort of what are the implications for Brazil, for how much room does he have to maneuver, and we could take it sort of issue by issue. I'm really curious about the environment. And the world is in a lot of ways, right? The fate of the Brazilian rainforest. Bolsonaro was pretty aggressively pro-development, one might put it that way. And under his watch, a considerable amount of land of rainforest was destroyed and converted, I guess, to agricultural uses. Where's Lula on this issue, and what difference will it make that he's president now?
Great question, and it is worthwhile to remember that in Lula's first presidency from 2003 to 2010, he had a much better record than Bolsonaro, but it was also the period of the commodity boom, in which prices for commodities were very high, and Brazil did lose significant amount of territory in the Amazon because of this aggressive export of commodities. The environmental activist minister who quit Lula's government in the first term because of that commodity boom and the kind of development that preceded is now back, Marina Silva. So she's now rejoined Lula's coalition and perhaps will be environment minister again. And Lula, in his acceptance speech for the presidency and in the way in which he ran this campaign, he made clear that he was going to do better, not only than Bolsonaro, but in fact better than his first term. And so I think that there can be hope that Brazil will take a different, more sustainable approach to development in this period. Anything is better than what Bolsonaro was doing. He was frankly genocidal in his treatment of the indigenous peoples that live in the Amazon in his effort to open it up to exploitation. So anything going forward is going to be better than that. But Lula and Brazil, because of the way that Brazil fits into the international economy, we will continue to have to, all of Brazilians and all of the world, pay attention to the environment and protecting it in Brazil and elsewhere.
Just a follow-up in Brazil, just how centralized is environmental policy? Is this within, how much power does the president have, say, relative to the governors in the states?
Sure. There are certain aspects that are quite decentralized. And so, in fact, the police forces that would, in theory, enforce a regulation on clearing land or on kicking peasants or indigenous off of their land for agribusiness, that police force is controlled by state governments, and there are many times in which those police forces participate in the dislocations of people and in cahoots with agribusiness and that have captured many local governments and state governments. And so in some ways, there are elements of policy that are very much localized, and those can be captured by different interests locally. But nationally, regulations around the environment, around the development strategy, the ministries and the agencies that are meant to protect the environment are very much centralized. Now then, Bolsonaro did everything he could to weaken them. He placed lobbyists from agribusiness in charge of environmental agencies. And so, it was a complete turning upside down of the function of these central institutions. And one can expect Lula to reform them, to give them back their teeth, and implement those national regulations in a way that they haven't been for the last 4 years.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about the economy. So certainly, and specifically inequality, which in some ways is the centerpiece, I suppose, of Lula's appeal historically and probably currently. You've been writing about this in your current work. Over the last 50 plus years, Brazil has become a wealthier nation, has grown at a faster clip economically than say the US, although not as fast as China. But it's been, this is one of the things you observe, it's not been that steady. It's been kind of boom and bust. And in part as a consequence, and maybe for other reasons as well, a tremendous amount of inequality. Certainly the gains were not equally shared in Brazil anymore, perhaps, than they were elsewhere. Lula faces a challenge, certainly in this moment. It's kind of a bust time. I mean, it's a difficult time for the economy. Presumably needs to stabilize the economy, grow, but at the same time, I would imagine there are a lot of expectations about his making good on the promise to do more for the poor and working class. So this is a similar question. What will he be able to do given opposition in the legislature and other the other constraints within which he has to operate?
I'll make a quick observation, and then perhaps if it seems like it fits, I'll offer a slightly more complex observation based on that research that I'm doing. The quick observation is that in the boom of the 2000s, when Lula was president, it was probably the first time in Brazilian history, which has experienced many booms, that there was rapid growth with an increase in equity. And this was directly the result of the social programs undertaken by that Workers' Party government, by the expansion in employment, especially formal employment, in other words, with all benefits and contract benefits, and a rise in the minimum wage. So basic policies to really address issues of equity in the midst of the boom did work and will work. But, Brazil, and this is the more complex reality, Brazil, like all developing countries, face a difficult scenario, which is that they have to fit into the international economy, and they need leading sectors and elites within those leading sectors to fit successfully and drive booms. But because of the unevenness of the way in which the international system works, those dynamic elites in developing countries are weak, are few in number. And unfortunately, they often fear the masses of lower classes asking for distribution more than other rivals. And instead of pursuing equitable growth that might include those lower classes, those dynamic elites all too often ally themselves with retrograde, corrupt, violent elites who are eager to use coercion and exclusion of lower classes in order to drive growth. And so you get models of growth and patterns of growth that concentrate wealth upwards, repress lower classes, are undemocratic. And so you can get short bursts of growth. And this is the history of countries like Brazil, but without distribution, without inclusion, you lack support for sort of the ongoing investments that would sustain growth. And you get these busts, and the busts all too often coincide with authoritarianism, as we've seen in Brazil in this turn towards Bolsonaro and the rest.
Yeah. So let me follow up on a couple things there. So, one is, what were the programs that led to distribution to be able to both grow and to become more equitable? What were those programs that seem to have been successful in Lula's first two terms?
Sure. I'll name a few, and at the most basic level, and this was a program that has been copied around the world now, Bolsa Familia, the family basket, was a payment made if parents took their kids to the doctor and put them in school. A minimum income to the poorest families in Brazil immediately lifted those who were in extreme poverty out of poverty. And that kind of a program targeted, really has a huge impact on one portion of the poor and working class and lifts them out of that extreme poverty. For others who perhaps are a little bit, farther away from that extreme poverty, but still poor, formal employment is something that makes a huge difference. So employment, that includes all of the benefits that go along with formality. So moving people from informal employment, where there's no unemployment, there's no health, there's no other of those other attached benefits, into formal employment makes a huge difference. And the kinds of, in many cases, state and private sector partnerships that were the state required formalization of contracts makes a big difference. And so formal employment, move people out of informal into formal employment, and the regulations that go along with that makes a big difference. And then raising the minimum wage. And so in Brazil, everything is indexed to the minimum wage. And so if you raise the minimum wage, not only do people who are earning minimum wages increase their salaries, but all salary contracts, or just about all of them, are written in terms of multiples of the minimum wage. And people say, I earn 3 minimum wages per month. I earn 8 minimum wages per month. And so when you increase the minimum wage, and that goes for pensions, that goes for all sorts of different benefits, when you raise the minimum wage, you immediately raise the incomes of those where that makes a difference. People who are on incredibly high salaries, raising the multiples of the minimum wage doesn't do that much for them. But it's the people who are on those smaller multiples of the minimum wage, that difference makes a big change in terms of their living standards. So I named those three sort of areas. I think that's really where we can point.
Yeah, and I guess the obvious next question is, how much of that is he going to be able to do this time? Both because, as you point out, his coalition actually depends on a kind of coalition both of left and center, more liberal economic policies, and because of the strong opposition from the Bolsonaro supporters.
Sure. One thing about Brazilian politics, Lula knows how to play this game, as I've said, and so that coalition that appears right now, virulently opposed to anything that Lula says or does or that his government might propose. Brazilian politics is characterized by a fragmented party system in which the ideologies of most of the parties really are pretty undefined. So there will be ways in which he can pick off allies, certainly from the left and the center, who already are close to his government and his program, and even some from that say that they're far right. There will be a coalition that allows him to govern. So he'll be able to get some stuff done. Now then, will it be the progressive program that perhaps he might have liked to adopt? I don't know. And it's also the case that in addition to that political reality, we are now in a new moment. So the 2000s was this commodity boom. We saw in this kind of pattern of globalization in that period that there's a way for Brazil to plug itself in and grow within global value chains in a way that some equity could also be pursued. The world has changed. We still are in a incredibly, and this is your work has looked very, very, very much at global value chains and the way in which that international system works. It's different. It's become, digitalization has become a center of accumulation in the national economy. The way in which Brazil is going to fit into the world system is going to be different. It's going to take all of the political and also sort of economic strategic skill to figure out a way to pursue growth, to renew growth, at the same time as they pursue equity. And we'll have to see it. There aren't good examples out there right now. We see a world where inequality is increasing, and it doesn't appear, at least since that 2009 crisis, that we've figured out how do you pursue growth while also advancing equity.
No, I think it's a great summary in some ways of both the conceptual and the practical challenges facing many countries around the world trying to figure out how to pursue both successfully. Let me turn to perhaps the thing that brought Lula down, or his successor down in Brazil, which was the issue of corruption. And there were a number of scandals during his first two terms, I guess particularly his second. He professed to not be aware of them. After he left power, of course, he was actually tried for money laundering, sentenced to prison for 9 years. And a part of his backstory that's quite remarkable. He was in prison not that long ago. Now, arguably those were trumped up charges and purely political, but there does appear from outside anyway to have been a problem for corruption. So that's really the question, was that a serious problem in the past? If so, I suppose, is this likely to be a cleaner era than those first two terms?
It's an important issue. It's and it's important because corruption is a problem in Brazil. It's a problem across the political and economic elite of that country, and the Workers' Party and Lula do have to address that issue. It should be said that, in my opinion, the Lula case, what put him in jail, was not about corruption at all. Yeah. It was a political device to remove him from that 2018 election. In theory, it would have opened the path to perhaps the center-right that many were amenable to win that election, but they've proven themselves to be incapable of winning elections. And in fact, it brought in Bolsonaro and the far right. It's interesting to look at the history of the Workers' Party, and they were in opposition for so long in the decades before they came to the presidency. They were actually the strongest party on fighting corruption as an opposition party. And in fact, in those local governments that they did govern, they were a party that took on corruption. And even in government, when Lula was president, all of the anti-corruption tools that sort of exist in the judiciary, in the attorney general, the prosecutor's office, were strengthened by the Workers' Party governments. But they also behaved like the traditional parties in terms of seeking campaign contributions and buying partisan allies, like I mentioned in the legislature. And that sort of behavior did, especially in the context of strengthened anti-corruption tools, did come back to bite them. So the entire political and economic elite have to deal with corruption, but it can't be a naive one. And so, it's the case that the US in particular has engaged in what I consider sort of a naive anti-corruption agenda all across Latin America, strengthening the tools to punish corruption, but ignoring the fact that really corrupt and retrograde elites in places like Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Brazil, distort those anti-corruption tools to persecute their rivals. And so what you get is a result, governments that are no less corrupt, but with great damage to democracy, to development, to international affairs. So, it's worth being clear. You have to address corruption. It is a problem for development, for democracy. It's highly inequitable. It favors elites, but a naive approach to fighting corruption produces negative outcomes.
That's very interesting. How the cure is worse than the disease, and if you don't approach it right. Well, you mentioned U.S. policy, and so let me turn to the question of the implications for the U.S. Relationship with Brazil. What does Lula's election mean for the hemisphere, but particularly in terms of the relationship with the United States?
This could be a very interesting moment for the United States, for Latin America, for Brazil. Lula is a historic figure, and winning the election again is even more historic. His path to the presidency now captures that much more world significance. For Latin America, Lula potentially could unite the region around issues of addressing climate change and the environment, equitable development, peaceful and multilateral resolution of problems, building the institutions that can pursue all of these cooperative, collaborative sorts of agendas. So Mercosur in the South, UNASUR, CELAC, the organizations of Latin American countries can all be strengthened by the historical leadership of someone like Lula. And as far as relationship with the US, the US would be wise to embrace it. Our track record has not been good in this regard. Too often, the US really prefers something like a hub and a spokes model, where all decisions go through DC, and each individual country in Latin America has to deal with the US on a case-by-case basis. So unity within Latin America has been interpreted as like a threat or something for the US, which makes no sense. We're huge. We are the regional, Goliath. We should be confident enough to accept this sort of, unity and coherence in Latin America. The foreign policy whisperer to Lula, Marco Aurelio Garcia, I met him once, and what he said was, the US is only civilized when Latin America is united. And I think that this insight was a good one, in the sense that, when the US gets away from that hub and spokes model and deals with Latin America on a sort of equal basis, then we get much better cooperative outcomes. Anyway, I'll stop there I'm
But
yeah.
it's again, from afar, it seems that I wouldn't say the U.S. has neglected Latin America, but it's really not where our gaze is these days in the U.S. And it always feels to me like we don't really, the U.S. has not really had a coherent strategy for Latin America. Of course, very focused on China. And of course the war in Russia, Ukraine, looking elsewhere. What is your take on the extent to which there is at this point something approaching a coherent strategy for engaging not just with Brazil but with all of Latin America?
Unfortunately, I'm not real hopeful about a coherent and reasonable U.S. policy towards Latin America. I look at the way in which the U.S. has dealt with issues on point by point, narrow vision, often driven by domestic politics more than a regional vision. And so, I look at Biden's Summit of the Americas last spring, and for whatever reason, probably for South Florida constituencies, he thought that he should exclude Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba from a Summit of the Americas in an attempt to isolate them. But the result was that a number of Latin American countries boycotted the summit, and it was the US that ended up isolated. And you say the same sort of thing with the blockade of Cuba. The UN has voted 30 years in a row against the US embargo. The last vote was 185-2. The US and Israel isolated pariahs in voting against a resolution to lift the embargo. The U.S. has not treated its Latin America in a coherent and reasonable way with sort of a regional strategy for a long time, and I hope that it changes.
The Cuba example is quite astonishing, isn't it? Well, let me ask you about Brazil's connection with China. There's a lot of interest, some would say sometimes concern about the extent to which China is increasingly involved in Latin America, and for that matter in Africa and elsewhere around the world. I'm not sure, but I suspect Brazil's trade with China now is probably now eclipsed the United States. And so, I'm just curious your take on what are the implications of that, both for Brazil, but in some sense for the conversation we were just having about this sort of hemispheric politics.
Sure. I think, Lula will return to and be even more significantly focused on South-South alliances. He was central in the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China coalition, and the formation of institutions and policies around that sort of a coalition. And I think that will continue. And also, Lula, because of his own history, because of his story, he brings certain things to that South agenda that I think are really healthy. So in his first presidency, the kinds of issues that he put right at the center of that South agenda were hunger, medicine, health. He put those agendas and said, these are the things that the South needs to work together to address, to find solutions, and to move on to the world stage and come up with, a collaborative and collective global solutions to problems that don't that cross borders, that that are not focused on one place or another. These are global issues, and I think that he's already signaled that he intends to do that again. He's proposed within the COP conversation. First of all, he's going. He's not the president yet. He's going to COP, or he's sending people to participate in COP. Bolsonaro is not. And within that conversation, he said he wants to create, with other countries that have large rainforests, an OPEC of the rainforests. And so he's going to put environment at the center of this South-South agenda. And I think that health, hunger, environment. These are the issues that the world should be focused on. And it's great if there's a South, voice that is moving them forward. With respect to China, China is already Brazil's biggest trading partner, as you noted. And Bolsonaro, who in his rhetoric was very anti-China and the rest, in reality, it's still the biggest trading partner with Brazil. Lula will drop the rhetoric, and he'll continue with that reality of a very close relationship. But I think that when it comes down to it, this is another opportunity for the US to engage more wisely. There are plenty of positive sum outcomes in development, in peace, in the environment, in advance of technology, where the US and China and third countries like Brazil could create a triangular relationship that is healthy, that's cooperative, that's collaborative, tone down the Cold War type of rhetoric that we see right now, and embrace those issues, find common ground, work separately where those issues don't exist. China is not going to be helpful on democracy. Okay, so that's not one of the ones that you can triangulate around. But all these other issues, find those opportunities and take them.
Yeah, very interesting. You to envision Lula kind of reemerging as a major leader in the global South, which of course he was before, but also to think about the ways in which the moment is different, and China's role is different than it was certainly 20 years ago. Although at times it wishes to ally itself with the global South and is very active in development. It's also much wealthier place than it was before, and in some ways more aggressive, certainly militarily, etc. So it'll be fascinating to see how Lula navigates that. Let me say in the audience that might have questions to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those in a few minutes. But we really want to be able to. I want to have Aaron address the things that might be on your mind. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. Let me in a way, we've been stepping back from Brazil, sort of widening the scope. Actually, your work is quite broad. You've done work in India. The current project is a comparative study of Brazil and India. You've done work in sub-Saharan Africa, and really, quite broadly around the world. So, Bolsonaro is of a type that we seem to see around the world. I saw the other day Orban in Hungary, a picture of him with John Mearsheimer, which is a conversation we could have. Those of you who know who Mearsheimer is, the leader of so-called but we could name people. Modi, of course, in India, who you study, et cetera, around the world. We've seen this rise of right-wing populist nationalists. As you look across all of these countries, what is it about this time, from your perspective, that seems to be generating this wave of these kinds of leaders?
It's a really interesting question. I think, history is going to define the way that we understand what's going on. But what I said earlier, I do want to return back to this notion that neoliberalism, the way in which the world was organizing global production and consumption and distribution prior to 2009, entered into crisis with that financial crisis that occurred. It showed that we had relied too much on finance to drive growth. The response to 2009 was kind of to go back to that same drawing board, quantitative easing, pump more liquidity into the national economy. Maybe we added high tech to kind of absorb some of that liquidity and renew growth, but we really didn't do anything for lower classes, even for middle classes who face greater precarity, more inequality. So there's really not a social base for just going back to that financial-led growth of neoliberalism, but there is still an upper class project. And fascism, hate, exclusion, blame, that's the tool that upper class economics uses to make itself popular. If you look back at sort of the 1930s, people looking at that period, another moment of crisis in which people were looking around, what's going to be the source of growth? And there was the possibility of reaction, of an upper class project. Well, fascism, in the words of Barrington Moore, makes reaction popular. The times are different. We're not in the 1930s anymore. And in fact, some of the things that are different that I would point to is that we don't have the same kind of socialist left challenge that we had in the 1930s, which was useful to the fascists. But also, as we've said, the global economy is very different. It's integrated in a completely different way. So neo-fascism is different than the fascism that we saw in the 1930s. But the core intuition of an upper class economic project needing hate in order to win elections continues. And so I think we could look at those examples that you named, and that's the story: is that there's an attempt to restart growth. It's an attempt that's driven by a sort of a narrow economic project, and in order to be popular and in order to win elections, they need that hate, they need that exclusion. And so that's where we see people like Modi and Bolsonaro and Trump.
Yeah. Well, this is a topic we could go into some depth. Maybe we'll do another session specifically on that. But it is fascinating to see both the parallels and, as you point out, some interesting differences between the 30s. So you commonly sort of draw an analogy to that time period, and perhaps for good reasons, and yet also useful to understand the differences. I do want to get to questions from our audience, and so let me do that. Gordon Stoik, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name, asked whether the federal government in Brazil has a legal right to force state governments to comply with federal laws that seek to reduce deforestation.
There are some tools that exist for the federal government to oblige governors, state governments, and local governments to enforce regulations. But there is a lot of autonomy for state governments and especially local governments when it comes to budgeting and when it comes to, like I said, the security forces. When it comes to regulating the economy, it is much more national. And so there are plenty of tools at the national level to kind of make it a fait accompli that couldn't be overturned just with the local police forces cracking people over the heads and moving them from one place to another. So I am hopeful that federal set of regulatory agencies and tools can be re-strengthened. Yeah.
Our colleague Karanai asks whether Lula's victory was more his popularity or discontent with Bolsonaro, and in a way, building on the conversation we just had, wondering whether the outcome gives some hope for the waning of what a right-wing populism there and elsewhere.
To the first part of the question, it's both. I mean, the center right that decided to vote for Lula this time clearly doesn't love Lula, but they voted because they love even less Bolsonaro, and so that explains their vote. And I think that there will be polling and study and research to kind of really pull apart what led people to cast their vote in this election. But it has to be both. Lula is who he is. He is an important figure historically of the left, of democratization, and so all of that does count. Does it give us any hope of the waning of right-wing populism? That movement now emerges extremely strong. It's ensconced in various institutions in Brazil. The techniques that they demonstrated continue to be viable. So misinformation, violence around elections, all of the anti-democratic practices that they pursued are still available, and you can bet that they will be repeated. And there are 58 million people that voted. So I don't think that this far right has been defeated definitively in Brazil, and I think that elsewhere the same sort of a risk will continue to exist.
Yeah. Of course, follow-up is what, why didn't Bolsonaro call the military to support him and keep him in power? Why didn't they, or so far have not done so?
So he gave them various opportunities. So I didn't mention in reflecting on his past that he was, of course, a military officer, and many of his appeals have been to return to military rule. And so he does have factions within the military that think like he do. And that might have supported a call to overturn the elections, to stage a coup, to keep him in power. And the kinds of things that he put in place, or that his supporters put in place, like the road blockades, were for exactly that reason. Could they cause enough chaos that the military would say, in order to stop this chaos, we need to step in? Well, in fact, there wasn't enough chaos. This was the strategy used in Bolivia, for example. There wasn't enough chaos, and so the military didn't. That the faction that would have supported that strategy didn't have enough support to draw it up. The report that he asked for is not something the military is supposed to necessarily do. A report evaluating the elections. Another opportunity that he gave the military. It appears that once again, the faction that might have liked to overturn the election lost out to those factions that did not. It wouldn't surprise me if there were other offers made and overtures made to call in the military for exactly that kind of a role. We'll see if those factions that are democratic continue to prevail, and we'll see.
That's great. So we Christiane from Brazil first thanks us for the opportunity to talk about Brazilian government. She wants Christiane wants to know more about the repercussions on the electoral process and Lula's victory. I guess repercussions here in the U.S.
Primeiramente, muito obrigado, Christiane. É bom te ver aqui na sala. I know who Christiane is, and it's nice to see her in the Zoom room. Thank you for the question. There are repercussions for the U.S. of Lula's victory. We've talked a little bit about the foreign policy implications, and I hope that they are healthy implications. In other words, if the U.S. has an interlocutor like Lula, like the Brazilian government, to engage with the whole of Latin America, I could see it being a much more balanced and equitable relationship, and Lula is the kind of leader who could sculpt exactly that sort of a conversation and narrative. As for the electoral process, I wish it would have more. Brazil runs good elections. The United States does not. And it's clear that we could learn a lot from the electronic voting in Brazil, the automatic registration of voters. What a bizarre concept. The idea that we make voting easy with free transportation to voting stations and putting voting on a day like Sunday. So all of these innovations, not rocket science, but innovations in the way to run elections, the U.S. could certainly learn from. I don't foresee the political coalition in Brazil, in the United States, in the United States, to adopt those kinds of reforms, but we would learn a lot and we would do a lot better if we did.
Great. A couple of questions really about Brazil's relationships in Latin America. General one, how do you think the relationships will change between Brazil and its neighboring countries? And our colleague Oliver Kaplan asking specifically about the relationship with Maduro and Venezuela. Will Lula be a backer of Maduro or a broker in some form?
Great questions. I think that Lula is immediately the elder statesman of Latin America, and other countries, especially there's been a wave of left, progressive, younger generation leaders who've been elected in Chile, in Bolivia, in other places where they will look to Lula for leadership, and his historic significance will make them responsive to the way in which he guides foreign policy. As for Maduro, I would hope that the position that Brazil takes and that Lula takes is one that that encourages negotiations, that makes it possible for negotiations to occur. Venezuela faces a situation in which you have a government that feels it's attacked on all sides, and you have an opposition that is pretty uncoordinated and weak in its ability to actually advance a democratic change in Venezuela. But there are international efforts to promote negotiations, and so in Mexico there's a Norwegian-backed process, and I understand that there's perhaps going to be a French supported process. Maduro just met with Macron on this issue. And so there are opportunities, neutral grounds, if you want to call it that, where negotiations might occur. And Brazil absolutely, with the figure of Lula as an elder statesman, could help to move those negotiations in a direction such that the Venezuelan government, Maduro, doesn't feel paranoid about entering into any negotiations and loosening any steps towards democracy, and at the same time that the opposition accepts reasonable steps towards democratization and doesn't fight amongst itself and also posit unreasonable demands.
Great. So we probably have time for one more quick question. Nicholas Arzaga asks how you see Lula affecting other countries in South America and their integration. I think, for example, the environmental case of the Amazon basin countries, the ways in which they might cooperate, presumably.
Great question. On the environment and on integration more generally, the agenda of Latin American and integration kind of halted. There was a US-driven attempt in the early 2000s, which Brazil and other Latin American countries halted for themselves. In its place, they presented an alternative sort of Latin American-driven integration process and started to institutionalize that in the late 2000s. But really, crisis, the flip-flopping of governments and regimes in the region meant that integration process halted. There's a long history of attempts at Latin American integration. Once again, Lula, his historic role, and really you need Brazil. If there's going to be any integration in Latin America, you need the biggest country, Brazil, to offer itself, because there are certain collective benefits that the biggest country has to pay for. If Brazil accepts paying some of those costs, it can pull the rest of Latin America along with it. And so we'll see if Brazil's willing to do that. And part of that may be on the environment. And so, if Brazil is willing to indicate that it's eager to pay those costs and make those sacrifices, then other countries that also share the Amazon, that share a concern with the environment, may be willing to go along. Now then, of course, there are other countries. Norway has promised significant funds to Brazil. They halted it under Bolsonaro. They're back now with Brazil saying that they will help to fund these kinds of collective sacrifices that have to be made if we're going to save the environment.
Well, Aaron, great conversation, covered a lot of territory on issues that are really central to the work we do here at the Korbel School on democracy, on environment, on economic inequality, and the like. So let me just thank you for an amazingly rich conversation. We covered a lot of territory in an hour. Thank you so much for being with us today on Faculty Friday, and let me thank all of you who took the time out of your day to join us for the conversation today. Thank you, and have a great rest of your Friday and great weekends, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.